From the MGMA in-home studios, welcome to the Insights Podcast. I'm Daniel Williams.
The key thing about these ransomware attacks that a lot of individuals need to know is that ransomware can be prevented, but it starts with a lot of that very good, those hygiene items that some organizations have plans in place to execute on, but need to improve and shrink the gap between our policies and procedures that we have in place and actually function, on the day-to-day. Simple things like patching and making sure our systems stay up to date, because that's one of the most common ways ransomware makes it into a network and infiltrates is it's taking advantage of something that's unpatched and unfixed in an environment.
That's Rob LeManuel talking about what medical practices can do to protect themselves against cyber attacks. We'll hear more from Rob in just a moment, but first, a word from our sponsor. RingCentral brings staff, patients, and payers together with compliant cloud communications and a modern call center on any device. A free new ebook from RingCentral and MGMA focuses specifically on the payer-provider relationship. With all too familiar patient reviews, must-see statistics, and a transformative case study, this ebook illustrates how easily cloud communications can bring patients, providers, and payers together. Download your copy at go.ringcentral.com/MGMA-healthcare. According to a recent report from Black Book Research, 73% of healthcare organizations report their infrastructures are unprepared to respond to cyber threats. Our guest today is Rob LeManuel, Chief Information Security Officer at FNTS. Rob will explain the threats to medical practices and tell what practice leaders can do to keep their information safe. Rob, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Looking at your bio, you are the Chief Information Security Officer at FNTS. Tell us about that organization and tell us a little bit about your role there.
FNTS is a cloud managed and security services provider founded way back in 1995, and it's a wholly owned subsidiary of First National of Nebraska, which happens to be the holding company for the largest private bank in the United States, First National Bank of Omaha. And that gives us a very strong heritage in serving regulated industries, namely finance and healthcare. So at FNTS, we advise, build, migrate, and manage and secure platforms, everything from your IBM I and Z series through open systems on virtualization platforms and traditional data center technologies and public cloud environments across several industry verticals and customer bases. And as you'd mentioned, I'm the Chief Information Security Officer. So as part of my role, I lead and guide my team to both help secure, guide, and protect the organization itself, as well as our service delivery for customers. And throughout the nature of our day-to-day, we also find ourselves consulting and advising our customers that may or may not have a strong or deep security bench strength spanning several platforms.
Mm-hmm. How long have you been at FNTS?
It will be 6 years in June.
Okay. Just trying to get some context then for our listeners. What have you guys been in the cloud and had this strong cloud presence during that entire 6 years, or has that evolved since you've been there? What's that been like?
Great question. Yes, we've actually had a FNTS, let's call it an FNTS powered cloud. So we own and manage our own data centers and cloud, and have been for a few decades now. We also branched out within the last 5 years into public cloud. So through my entire tenure, we've had multiple presences, both owned by FNTS and then managed by FNTS in several cloud environments.
Okay. So you guys, as you said, you're very involved with the different regulated industries. One of those regulations that we've seen from the healthcare side has been telehealth during the pandemic. We've seen some of those restrictions loosened. We've seen people be able to have more and more of those virtual visits, but then that opens up more, I guess, opportunities for different breaches and things along those lines. So talk about that for us. Where is your and the company's primary focus been over these last 12, 13 months, since so much work has been taking place from a virtual environment?
The focus of the last, as you mentioned, 12, 13, 14-ish months has primarily been on securely enabling organizations' cloud shift. And I say cloud shift since predominantly organizations had been examining, focusing, looking at application modernization or looking at new operating models, leveraging some sort of cloud presence to help them in their customer service delivery or internal efficiency gains. And the pandemic, as we've seen, has enhanced and caused folks to look at that with greater intensity. The velocity is picked up, so the cloud shift in all forms, whether it's been infrastructure, software as a service, or platform as a service, has really increased, right? And coupled with that, our focus has been guidance to those organizations on how to focus those priorities. And recently, as you had mentioned, regulations have been shifting to accommodate more flexible and friendly delivery mechanisms for that protected health information. I know recently we saw updates to the HIPAA Safe Harbor law that allowed organizations to that followed industry standard best practices on their core operations and delivering services to not be as impacted in the event of a security breach from a regulatory fine standpoint. And then lastly, the focus has been on staying on top of evolving threats, ensuring that our threat models and what adversaries are shifting their focus, making sure that we're guiding our customers and staying on top of that so that they're not taken advantage of at some of the weakest points.
Mm-hmm. Your team sent me over some numbers from a recent Black Book research report. One of the statistics that really jumped out at me was that 73% of healthcare organizations report their infrastructures are unprepared to respond to cyber threats. That number definitely got my attention. Tell us about that. Tell us what's going on out there in your working with healthcare organizations and really where those threats are coming from.
Yeah, with the as you mentioned, nearly 3/4 of healthcare organizations reported that they're unprepared to respond to cyber threats. I think that's a reflection on the complexity of the current environment. First, IT, and to an extent, IT security, largely cost centers within organizations. So organizations have aligned some of those resources to meet what they think are some of the minimum requirements, which pales in comparison to where you see your threats. Your threats are constantly evolving. They're targeting either the latest and greatest vulnerabilities that are being announced, or they're launching sophisticated phishing or spam attacks to employees. And if you don't have strong awareness programs, for example, that are effective in measuring and monitoring and educating employees, then that can be a constant weak point. And so you see a resource struggle between internal teams' capabilities and all of these points of avenue that adversaries are trying to exploit. Again, whether that's email, whether it's now virtual health information consumption, folks targeting consumers themselves, and all points in between. And it really goes back to, again, the resource mismatch between what healthcare organizations have available to combat the threats and what seems to be almost a limitless resource pool from the adversary standpoint.
Mm-hmm. We're currently talking through a platform that uses Zoom as its primary, communication method here. There are millions and millions of people across America these last year plus that have been using Zoom or some form like that. When this pandemic first hit, people started working remotely. People turned to Zoom in particular, but other platforms as well to communicate. We saw breaches initially. I want to get your thoughts on that. Was that something that didn't surprise you when people were able initially to jump into these Zoom calls and kind of photobomb them, so to speak, and disrupt those meetings? Was that something you would have predicted, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think that was a natural progression of the rapid shift to cloud services, and something that could have been prevented. But as you had mentioned, that the rapid adoption of either the free or no to low cost options that don't have maybe the most preferred security settings enabled from the start led to a lot of that complication, the Zoom bombing, as you would call it, and really listening in on other folks' meetings. Through the course of the increased usage, we both saw the changes that organizations made to enhance security settings from the start, require passwords and end-to-end encryption, all of those nuances that were already in some of the more premium paid versions of the applications made their way down to the freely consumable versions. And it's little settings and changes like that need to become synonymous with how we operate and how we consume a variety of services today as consumers, whether we're consuming services through telehealth, or we're accessing financial information, ensuring connections are encrypted, that we're only accessing resources from a trusted and safe, secure mechanism, that we are using multi-factor or multiple forms of authentication when logging in, and not reusing passwords, right? All of these little basic hygiene items go a long way to preventing everything from the Zoom bombing to information loss and disclosure. Okay.
I want to go back to that number from the Black Book research report, that 73%. Is that broken down at all? The reason I ask is a large number of our listeners are executives and leaders who work at medical practices, medical groups. I know that they are often the ones that do get targeted because they house patient information, patient data. We have seen those held for ransom at times. So how does that break out? Is that really who you're talking about when we say the term healthcare organizations, or what are we looking at here?
Yeah, great question. The healthcare organizations is really loosely defined under that figure. It's just about any organization over, I believe, anywhere between 50 and 100 employees and higher that stores, processes, transmits, that has electronic protected health information. So it's a pretty large pool of data points when they're talking about that. But regardless of the size or the focus within the healthcare industry, a lot of organizations face some of those same challenges, right? It could be core applications or core infrastructure may not be able to be patched or updated, or there might be limitations on some of the software on what we can control. So then you start to think of how can we layer or wrap security protections or precautions or best practices around that, and everything in between. And so the problem is still pertinent no matter the organization size and complexity. It's just the number of resources you have available to focus on some of these ongoing challenges. You have more at your disposal the larger the organization it is, but that also the number of challenges still increases nearly linearly.
Okay. In our house, people have across the country have binge watched certain shows, certain types of shows. In our house, we have gotten very interested in different types of mysteries. We've watched a lot of the Scandinavian mysteries and other European mysteries, and have really gotten into, forever we consumed the whodunits, but now there's been a move toward the whydunits. We know who the perpetrator is in many of these cases, but then there's that forensic work to figure out, all right, but why? What was the motivation? And that's where I want to get to from you is why are people doing this? What are the motivations, and what are they getting out of this?
So we know that medical records and medical information happens to be the most sought after on some of the let's call it the dark webs, right? Or some of the some of the sites where our information is stolen. I think it can go up to as much as $150 per record. And when you have an opportunity that there's hundreds or thousands or potentially millions of records ripe for the taking at certain organizations, you can see how that becomes a very large target to set, folks that want to steal that information, because that personal information, your electronic protected health information, could provide nearly everything to a adversary that would want to commit everything from identity theft, insurance fraud, or other follow-up scams to those targets. You contrast that with credit card numbers. Those rarely sell for more than a few dollars, even when those function. So all of a sudden now you understand why there's such a big target. And you also layer on top of that healthcare breaches themselves cost nearly double on average, right? So, hair over 7 million per breach on average, when the average is about 3.8 million for all industries, because of, the highly sensitive information, the fines due to regulations and handling patient care facilities such as HIPAA.
Mm-hmm. Do you have an example, a case study, anything you could share with us about a cyber attack so we get a better idea from that insider's point of view on what this looks like and how it can devastate an organization?
You bet. Let's focus on ransomware briefly, since I know that's an attack that several of us have heard, and you hear it also in the news, and we can identify with it. And ransomware itself accounted for just over half of 2020's healthcare breaches. And you have in the news, I'm trying to think back, last year, I believe it was a hospital system in Germany where they reported a patient actually passed away from not being able to receive medical services because the hospital systems were taken over by a malware that had encrypted the hospital's core information system. So ransomware, it was encrypted, not being able to be used by the staff. The information itself was held ransom, hence the name ransomware, unless they were to pay in denomination, usually that's Bitcoin or that digital currency, to attackers. And ransomware can take all sorts of forms, right? Typically, folks will download a compromised email attachment and then execute that file and run that file on a system. And that has the potential to run amok on an organization's network. The key thing about these ransomware attacks that a lot of individuals need to know is that ransomware can be prevented, but it starts with a lot of that very good, those hygiene items that some organizations have plans in place to execute on, but need to improve and shrink the gap between our policies and procedures that we have in place and actually function, on the day-to-day. Simple things like patching and making sure our systems stay up to date, because that's one of the most common ways ransomware makes it into a network and infiltrates is it's taking advantage of something that's unpatched and unfixed in an environment.
Mm-hmm. Earlier, you mentioned best practices. So you've already identified that, gosh, nearly 3/4 of organizations are at risk. They don't feel like they're completely protected there. So let's really return to those best practices then. Walk us through either a checklist or maybe some first steps that practices can take to make sure that they are safe, or at least as safe as they can possibly be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing that we're going to talk about with these best practices is administer the obvious. And when I say obvious, is know where your most valuable information is on your network, your crown jewels. We want to start with the very basics. So once you know where that is, then we have to establish and enforce policy, standards, and guidelines. We have to find and fix holes and vulnerabilities, and then we have to control the access in an environment. So think the who, what, when, why, and how. And then for our organization, why, we need to guide, assist, and train, and know what to do when you have an incident. So very, very basic items. If you abstract that down the next layer into, okay, well, that's great. Those are just, guidelines on what I should do. What does that actually mean in the real world? It means make sure that our information systems are staying up to date and auto update when we can. I know a lot of enterprises have more refined processes around updating. We need things like your antivirus or your endpoint protection. You need things like email security protection, spam and phishing, prevention, encrypted communications such as a virtual private network or VPN, and so forth. So to advise those listening, take advantage of the freely available best practices information, the NIST or ISO, or even HITRUST, provide a common set of controls and guidelines that should not supplement your organization from tailoring it to its, to your own organization, but can help give you that roadmap on where to start, things to think about, to implement, and shore up in the organization.
All right, well, thanks for that. Now, one of the things I've noticed at our company, and I've learned this from talking to other practice leaders as well, is that once you have a system in place, it's continuing to upgrade. It's continuing to make sure the measurements and the processes that you have in place are working. So what are some of then the main KPIs or other data points or analysis you'd recommend practices look at, be aware of, to make sure the security you've put in place is in fact working?
That's a great question. The three biggest and strongest KPIs and metrics that I use are my mean time to identification, my mean time to containment, and mean time to remediation. And I apply those three metrics across the different areas within my security program. So when we go back to identification, let's put it under the purview of vulnerabilities. How long does it take me to identify, contain, and resolve vulnerabilities? and track whether I am accomplishing that within my policies and procedures that I set out. That allows organizations to set a baseline, right? Establish a baseline and determine the moving target from where you set out to function. And you can track and ensure the health of different functions within your security program, whether it's incident response, operations, engineering, so forth. I know other organizations, including ours, also track the number of security incidents, which can be categorized in different formats, whether it's inadvertent information disclosure, it could be an actual data loss event. Categorizing and tracking security incidents also helps you understand what is working and what is not working within your security program and where folks are being challenged the most.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, you've touched on a lot of aspects about cybersecurity here. What's a main takeaway? If you had one takeaway you'd want our audience to know about cybersecurity best practices, what would that be?
To sum it up, it would be the little things make the biggest difference. Don't ignore the basic building blocks of protecting information and repeating those throughout your day-to-day. If I could add one more line on there, it would be to think about information security, think about best practices in a way that how can you eliminate the concept of trust within your IT and IT security organization. It sounds a bit scary to say that, wow, he doesn't want me to trust anybody, but when you get down to it, security breaches and compromises are the result of the abuse of trust within an organization. So how can we structure our controls and protection mechanisms that we are only trusting those with the information when it's needed?
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. I want to switch gears for a final question. The pandemic has stressed us in certain ways. It's put us into a new normal. And I've been asking guests on here what they've been doing to make sense of things, find some work-life balance, any hobbies or any other activities they've, taken part in to help them, find some joy and happiness during this time. What's been top of mind to you?
My biggest relief and biggest getaway has been spending increased time with my family. It has actually allowed us to be able to focus more on things around the house. So common family activities, whether it's your board games, your puzzles, projects around the home, and exploring the community in nature and areas around us that we probably wouldn't have put a lot of focus on historically due to the busy nature of pre-pandemic life. So finding the joys in what's around and already available to us and building a strong family connection. As you know, though, with the restrictions lifted, we've slowly been able to get out and do some of those other hobbies in a safe format that we were able to do before the pandemic. But it's been a eye opener as far as the connections you can make at home and the satisfaction that comes out of a strong family unit.
All right. Well, that's wonderful. Rob, I want to thank you for sharing that and sharing all of these ideas on cybersecurity with us. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Happy to help.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Insights. Thanks to our guest, Rob LeManuwriter. And thanks to Ring Central for sponsoring this week's show. Ring Central is offering a free new ebook focusing on the payer-provider relationship. Download your copy at go.ringcentral.com/mgma-healthcare. If you like the show, please rate and review it wherever you get your podcast. If you have topics you'd like us to cover, or experts you'd like us to interview, email us at podcast@mgma.com. Or you can find me on Twitter at MGMADaniel. MGMA Insights is presented by Declan McGee, Rob Ketchum, and I'm Daniel Williams. Stay safe, and thanks for listening.
Hi, this is Declan McGee, one of the producers for the MGMA Insights podcast. If you like the work we're doing, please consider becoming an MGMA member. Learn more at mgma.com/membership. Thanks.